The shadow of death whistled through the narrow ravine as Madeline Zanetti clutched her father's pocket watch, the last remnant of her family, while 7 riders encircled her like vultures closing in on a dying creature. It was 1875 in the Colorado Territory, a time when law existed only in scattered pockets of civilization, and Madeline had strayed too far from any of them. "Nowhere to run now, Miss Zanetti," drawled Silas Thorne, the leader of the notorious Thorne gang that had terrorized the stage-coach routes from Denver to Durango for the past 3 years. His weathered face, scarred from a knife fight in Abilene, twisted into a cold smile. "Your father's debts come due today." Madeline backed against the rough stone wall, feeling the jagged edges press through her dusty blue traveling dress. Her chestnut hair had come loose from its pins during her desperate flight, and now it whipped around her face in the rising wind. The setting sun cast long shadows across the ravine, turning the outlaws into menacing silhouettes. "My father owed you nothing," she said, voice steadier than she felt. "Those mining claims were legally his." Thorne spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the dusty ground. "Legal's just a word, darlin'. Out here, possession's the only law that matters." He nodded to his men. "Search her saddlebags, find those deed papers." 2 riders dismounted and approached her horse, which stood nervously a few yards away. The animal had carried her valiantly when she'd spotted the gang following her from the Smallway station where she'd stopped for water. But the mare had tired, and Madeline had made the fatal error of seeking refuge in this box canyon, not realizing until too late that she'd trapped herself. "Please," she said, "those papers are all I have left. The claim is barely producing enough to keep me fed." "Should have thought of that before your pa crossed me," Thorne replied, drawing his revolver and checking the cylinder with practiced ease. "Maybe we'll let you live if you've got something else to offer instead." The way his eyes traveled down her body left no question as to his meaning. The other men chuckled darkly, and Madeline felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. The sound of hoofbeats echoing off the ravine walls made all 7 outlaws turn. A lone rider appeared at the mouth of the canyon, silhouetted against the blood-red sunset. He sat tall in the saddle of a powerful black stallion, the brim of his hat pulled low over his face. "Even in, gentlemen," the stranger called, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "Seems like an unfair fight. 7 against 1 lady doesn't speak well of your courage." Thorne's face darkened. "Ride on, mister. This ain't your concern. I'm making it my concern." The stranger nudged his horse forward at an unhurried pace. As he drew closer, Madeline could make out his features. Strong jaw darkened with stubble, piercing blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, and a quiet confidence that somehow made him seem larger than just one man. "Name's Pierce Dawson," he said, stopping his horse about 20 paces from the group. "I suggest you boys let the lady go and ride out while you still can." One of Thorne's men, a rail, thin outlaw with a pockmarked face, cackled. "You hear that, Silas? One man thinks he can take all 7 of us." Thorne's eyes narrowed. "Dawson, the ranger from Texas, former ranger," Pierce corrected. "Now I'm just a man who doesn't like seeing folks bullied." Madeline stared at her unlikely defender. She'd heard whispers about Pierce Dawson, stories told in hushed voices around campfires. They said he'd tracked the Comanchero gang across 3 territories after they'd murdered a family of settlers. They said he never drew unless he meant to fire, and never fired unless he meant to kill. "Last chance," Pierce said, his hand resting casually near his holster. "The lady rides out with me, and nobody has to die today." Thorne's face contorted with rage. "Kill him!" The ravine exploded into chaos. Pierce's hand moved with lightning speed, his Colt Army revolver clearing leather and firing before most of the outlaws could even reach for their weapons. The first shot caught the pockmarked outlaw square in the chest, throwing him backward off his horse. Madeline dropped to the ground as bullets whined overhead, ricocheting off the canyon walls. Pierce had already dismounted, rolling behind a boulder for cover as he exchanged fire with the gang. His movements were fluid, each shot placed with deadly precision. 2 more outlaws fell in quick succession before the remaining men realized they needed better positions. They scattered, seeking cover behind rocks and scrubby brush. Thorn bellowed orders, trying to coordinate an attack from multiple angles. Pierce glanced toward Madeline. "When I give the word, run to my horse," he shouted over the gunfire. "But they'll shoot you," she called back. "Not if I give them something else to worry about." He reached into his saddle bag and pulled out a stick of dynamite, the kind used in mining operations. With practiced hands, he struck a match on his boot and lit the fuse. "Get ready," he warned, then hurled the explosive toward the largest cluster of outlaws. The dynamite landed among them, sending them scrambling in panic. The explosion rocked the ravine, dust and debris raining down. "Now," Pierce yelled. Madeline didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward his horse, heart pounding in her chest. A bullet kicked up dirt at her feet, but she kept running, driven by pure survival instinct. She reached the stallion and pulled herself into the saddle. Pierce fired 3 more shots in quick succession, each finding its mark. Only Thorn and one other outlaw remained, both pinned down behind a fallen boulder. Pierce backed toward his horse, never taking his eyes off their position. "Ride," he commanded as he swung up behind her, taking the reins. He kicked the stallion into motion, and the powerful animal leaped forward, carrying them toward the mouth of the ravine. Bullets peppered the ground behind them as Thorn and his remaining man fired wildly in frustration. Pierce kept his body between Madeline and the gunfire as they galloped out of the ravine and into the gathering dusk. They rode hard for nearly an hour, putting distance between themselves and the outlaws. The terrain changed from rocky ravines to rolling hills dotted with scrub brush and the occasional stunted pine. Finally, when the horse began to tire, Pierce guided them into a small hollow protected by a stand of cottonwoods beside a narrow stream. "We should be safe here for the night," he said, dismounting and helping Madeline down. His hands were strong and calloused, but unexpectedly gentle. "They won't be able to track us in the dark." Madeline's legs trembled as she stood on solid ground again. The reality of what had just happened, how close she had come to death, or worse, washed over her in a wave that made her knees buckle. Pierce caught her before she fell. "Easy now," he murmured. "You're safe." She looked up at him, seeing his face clearly for the first time without the chaos of gunfire around them. He was handsome in a rugged way, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled more than he frowned, though his expression now was serious. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved my life back there." "Anyone would have done the same," he said, though they both knew that wasn't true. Few men would have faced such odds willingly. "Why did you?" she asked as he helped her sit on a fallen log. Pierce busied himself unsaddling his horse. "I was tracking Thorn myself. He and his gang robbed a stagecoach last week, killed the driver and a passenger." He paused. "I didn't expect to find them cornering a lady in that ravine, though." Madeline twisted her hands in her lap. "They want my father's mining claim. He died last month pneumonia and left me the deed to a silver mine outside of Denver. It's not much, but it's all I have. Thorn claims my father owed him money, but it's a lie." Pierce nodded, setting up a small camp with the efficiency of a man who'd spent most of his life outdoors. "Thorn's known for trying to intimidate legitimate claim holders into selling cheap or just running them off entirely." "Are you really a Texas Ranger?" she asked. He corrected, gathering wood for a small fire. "For 8 years. Now I work for the Rocky Mountain Detective Association out of Denver." He glanced up at her. "Tracking men like Thorn is what I do." As darkness settled completely around them, Pierce built a small, nearly smokeless fire, positioning it so the flames couldn't be seen from a distance. He offered Madeline some jerky and hardtack from his provisions, along with water from his canteen. "It's not much of a dinner," he apologized. "It's more than I expected to have tonight," she said softly. The fire cast a warm glow on her features, highlighting the elegant curve of her cheekbones and the determination in her honey-brown eyes. "I thought I might be dead." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Madeline spoke again. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" "I've never seen anyone draw so fast." A ghost of a smile touched Pierce's lips, My father taught me. He was a lawman in East Texas, said if I was going to carry a gun, I'd better be the best with it or not carry it at all. He took a sip of water. What about you? How'd a lady like yourself end up alone with a mining claim in Colorado? Madeline sighed. My father was always chasing the next big strike. We moved from California to Nevada, then to Colorado when I was 16. He was sure this claim would be the one to make us rich. She twisted her father's pocket watch in her hands. It wasn't, but he loved it out here. When he died, I couldn't bear to sell it, even though every bank in Denver has refused me a loan to develop it properly. It's not easy for a woman alone in mining country, Pierce observed. No, it isn't. But I'm more stubborn than most. A small smile played across her lips. My father used to say I got my stubbornness from my mother. She followed him to every mining camp without complaint until consumption took her when I was 12. Pierce studied her across the fire. What will you do now? Thorne won't give up easily. I don't know, she admitted. I can't go back to my cabin near the mine. That's the first place they'll look, and I don't have enough money to start over somewhere else. I'll get you safely to Denver, Pierce said. I have friends there who can help protect you until we deal with Thorne permanently. Madeline raised an eyebrow. I've been after him for months, Pierce explained. He's wanted for murder, robbery, extortion, the list goes on. But he's slippery, always seems to know when the law is closing in. He poked at the fire with a stick. This might be my best chance to finally bring him to justice. Madeline studied him. And what's your stake in this, Mr. Dawson? Is there a bounty? Pierce, he corrected. And no bounty I'm interested in. Something dark flashed across his face. Let's just say I have my reasons for wanting to see Thorne behind bars or in the ground. There was history there, Madeline realized, but she didn't press. They had just met, after all, and everyone in the West carried secrets. As the night deepened, Pierce insisted Madeline take his bedroll while he kept watch. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Thorne's leering face or heard the crack of gunfire. Eventually, she sat up and found Pierce sitting against a tree, his rifle across his lap, gazing up at the stars. Can't sleep? He asked without looking at her. No, she admitted, wrapping his blanket around her shoulders and moving to sit near him. Every time I try, I just relive what happened in the ravine, Pierce nodded. That's normal. The mind needs time to settle after something like that. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the chorus of night insects and the occasional hoot of an owl. The moon had risen, casting silver light across the landscape. Tell me about Denver, Madeline said eventually. I've only been there twice for supplies. Pierce's expression softened. It's growing fast, new buildings going up every month. There's a real opera house now and gas lighting on some streets. It's still rough around the edges, but it's becoming a real city. It sounds wonderful, Madeline said wistfully. My father always promised we'd move to a proper city someday once we struck it rich. She hugged her knees to her chest. I've spent most of my life in mining camps and frontier towns. What would you do if you could do anything? Pierce asked. Madeline considered the question. No one had ever asked her that before. I'd open a small shop, she said finally. A bookstore, maybe. I've always loved reading, even though books are hard to come by out here. She glanced at him. What about you? Has being a lawman always been your plan? A shadow passed over Pierce's face. Not always. Once I thought I might be a rancher, had a piece of land picked out near the Brazos River. He fell silent for a long moment. Things changed. What happened? Madeline asked gently. Pierce stared into the dying embers of their fire. I was engaged back in Texas. Her name was Sarah. We were going to build that ranch together. His jaw tightened. She was traveling to visit her sister when the stagecoach was attacked. Silas Thorne was just starting out then, building his reputation. He killed everyone aboard, even though they'd surrendered all their valuables. Madeline's hand flew to her mouth. Oh, Pierce, I'm so sorry. That was 5 years ago, he said, his voice flat. I joined the Rangers the next day, and I've been hunting men like Thorne ever since. He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. So you see, this isn't just another job for me. Without thinking, Madeline reached out and touched his hand. We'll get him, she said with quiet conviction. For Sarah and for all the others he's hurt. Pierce looked down at her hand on his, then back to her face. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits who understood loss and perseverance. Try to get some sleep, he said finally, his voice gentle. We have a long ride to Denver tomorrow. Madeline nodded and returned to the bedroll, but before she closed her eyes, she glanced back at Pierce's silhouette against the night sky. The mysterious former ranger had saved her life today, but she sensed there was much more to him than just a skilled gunman. As sleep finally claimed her, she wondered what tomorrow would bring and whether their paths would continue to be entwined beyond reaching the safety of Denver. Dawn broke with the sharp clarity unique to the high country, painting the eastern sky in bands of gold and rose. Pierce had allowed himself only brief moments of sleep throughout the night, his senses attuned to any sound that might signal pursuit. But the night had passed quietly, and now he gently woke Madeline as the first sunlight touched their campsite. We should move soon, he said, offering her a strip of jerky and the last of his coffee, prepared from the small amount of grounds he carried in his saddlebags and heated over a briefly rekindled fire. We're about a day's ride from Denver if we push hard. Madeline accepted the meager breakfast gratefully. The night's rest, though fitful, had restored some of her spirit, and in the clear light of morning, her natural resilience had reasserted itself. She combed her fingers through her tangled hair, attempting to restore some order to her appearance. Do you think they're still following us? She asked, scanning the surrounding landscape with wary eyes. Pierce finished saddling his stallion before answering. Thorn's not the kind to give up easily, especially after losing men. But we covered a lot of ground last night, and I took us through some rocky terrain where we wouldn't leave much of a trail. They set out as the sun cleared the eastern horizon, riding double on Pierce's powerful stallion. Madeline sat in front, Pierce's arms around her to hold the reins. Despite the circumstances, she found herself acutely aware of his proximity, the solid strength of his chest against her back, the faint scent of leather and pine that seemed to cling to him. The landscape gradually changed as they rode, the rugged hills giving way to more open country dotted with stands of ponderosa pine and aspen. They followed game trails where possible, avoiding the main roads where Thorn might have men watching. Around midday, they paused by a clear-running stream to rest the horse and stretch their legs. Pierce filled their canteens while Madeline washed her face and hands in the cool water. There's a small trading post about an hour's ride from here, Pierce said as he checked his weapons. Run by an old mountain man named Josiah who served with Kit Carson. If anyone's been asking after us, he'll know, and he's no friend to outlaws. Can we trust him? Madeline asked, wringing water from the hem of her dress, which had been soaked while crossing the stream. With our lives, Pierce confirmed. He saved mine once, years ago, when I was tracking a fugitive through a blizzard, found me half frozen and nursed me back to health. True to Pierce's word, they reached the trading post little more than a log cabin with a rough-hewn porch after about an hour's ride. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and several horses were hitched to the rail out front. Pierce frowned at the sight of the other mounts. "Stay close," he murmured as they dismounted. "Let me do the talking." The interior of the cabin was dimly lit by windows too small to allow in much sunlight, a defensive feature, Madeline realized. The space smelled of tobacco, leather, and coffee. 3 rough-looking men sat at a table playing cards, while a 4th leaned against the counter talking to an elderly man with a flowing white beard. Conversation stopped when Pierce and Madeline entered, all eyes turning to assess the newcomers. Pierce kept his hand near his gun but offered a casual nod to the room at large. The bearded man behind the counter, Josiah, Madeline presumed squinted at them for a moment before his weathered face broke into a grin that revealed several missing teeth. "Well, I'll be damned." "Pierce Dawson, as I live and breathe," he exclaimed, coming around the counter with surprising agility for a man of his years. "Thought you might be dead by now, the chances you take." Pierce clasped the old man's hand warmly. "Not yet, Josiah, though some have tried their best to arrange it." Josiah's gaze shifted to Madeline, curiosity evident in his roomy eyes. "And who's this pretty young thing? Don't tell me you've finally found yourself a wife." Madeline felt heat rise to her cheeks, but Pierce answered smoothly, "Miss Zanetti is under my protection, Josiah." "We've had some trouble with Sela's Thorne's gang." At the mention of Thorne, the card players exchanged glances, their hands shifting subtly closer to their weapons. Josiah's expression grew serious. "Thorne, a bad business that," he lowered his voice. "In fact, had some fellows in here not 3 hours ago asking after a woman matching this lady's description. Said she'd stolen something valuable from them." Pierce's posture tensed slightly. "What did you tell them?" "Told him I hadn't seen hide nor hair of any woman out this way in weeks," Josiah said with a wink. "But they didn't much look like they believed me. Left a man watching the road about a mile east. We came in from the west," Pierce said, "following the stream." "Smart," Josiah nodded approvingly. "Now, what can I do for you two, besides keeping my mouth shut about your passing through, which goes without saying?" "We need supplies for the last leg to Denver," Pierce said. "And if you've got a dress or shirt the lady could change into, hers is rather distinctive." While Pierce gathered provisions, Josiah led Madeline to a small back room filled with an assortment of goods. He rummaged through a trunk and produced a simple brown dress. "Belonged to a settler's wife who couldn't pay her bill last winter," he explained. "Not as fine as yours, I reckon, but it'll help you blend in." "Thank you," Madeline said sincerely, accepting the garment. "It's perfect." While she changed, she could hear the murmur of conversation from the main room. When she emerged in the plain dress, her hair tucked up under a worn bonnet Josiah had also provided, she found Pierce and the old trader bent over a rough map drawn on the counter. "Avoid the main road entirely," Josiah was saying. "This old trapper's path here runs parallel for about 15 miles before joining up with the Denver road much closer to town. Rough going in spots, but passable." Pierce looked up as Madeline approached. Something flickered in his eyes' appreciation, perhaps before he returned to the business at hand. "How many of Thorne's men did you see?" "4, including the lookout they left behind," Josiah said, stroking his beard. "But one looked pretty banged-up arm in a sling." "Must have been from your dust-up yesterday." "That still leaves Thorne and 2 others unaccounted for," Pierce muttered. "They could be watching other approaches to Denver." The card game had resumed, but Madeline noticed the players were paying more attention to their conversation than their cards. One man in particular, a swarthy individual with a puckered scar along his jaw, kept glancing their way. She touched Pierce's arm lightly and inclined her head subtly toward the table. He gave an almost imperceptible nod to show he'd noticed, then returned his attention to Josiah. "We'll take that trapper's path," he decided. "And we'd best be moving before your other visitors decide to circle back." Josiah gathered their supplies into a pair of saddlebags. "On the house," he said, waving away Pierce's attempt to pay. "Consider it payment for thinning Thorne's ranks." "The devil's been bad for honest business out here." As they prepared to leave, the scarred man stood up from the card game. "Weather's looking mighty unsettled," he remarked casually. "Might want to hold off traveling till it passes." Outside, the sky remained clear and blue. Pierce's hand moved to rest on his gun. "Appreciate the concern," he said evenly, "but we'll take our chances with the weather." The man shrugged, but his eyes were cold. "Suit yourself." Pierce guided Madeline out with a hand at the small of her back, his body positioned between her and the card players. Outside, he helped her mount before swinging up behind her. "That man was one of Thorne's," Madeline whispered as they rode away from the trading post. "Yes," Pierce agreed, keeping their pace unhurried until they were out of sight of the cabin. "But he was outnumbered, with Josiah being no friend to outlaws. Still, he'll report back as soon as we're gone." They found the trapper's path Josiah had described and urged the horse into a faster pace. The trail was indeed rough, winding through stands of pine and across rocky slopes, but it kept them well hidden from the main road. They rode in tense silence, both scanning constantly for signs of pursuit. As afternoon wore on, dark clouds began building over the mountains to the west, a genuine storm this time. not the fiction invented by the man at the trading post. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. "We need to find shelter before that hits," Pierce said, eyeing the approaching storm with concern. "Flash floods are common in these parts when it rains hard." They crested a ridge and spotted a small cabin nestled in a grove of aspens about half a mile ahead. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating occupation. Pierce frowned. Not ideal to approach strangers, but that storm's moving fast. No sooner had he spoken than a jagged bolt of lightning split the sky, followed almost immediately by a tremendous crack of thunder. The stallions snorted nervously, and fat raindrops began to pelt them. "Let's risk it," Madeline said as the rain intensified. "Worst case, they turn us away." They rode quickly down the slope toward the cabin. As they approached, the door opened and a woman stepped onto the porch, a shotgun held cautiously in her hands. She appeared to be in her 50s, her gray streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun, her expression wary but not hostile. "That's close enough," she called over the rising wind. "State your business." Pierce raised his hands to show he meant no harm. "Madam, we're just travelers caught in the storm, looking for shelter until it passes if you can spare it." The woman's eyes narrowed as she assessed them. "Just the two of you?" "Yes, madam," Pierce confirmed. "I'm Pierce Dawson, formerly of the Texas Rangers, now with the Rocky Mountain Detective Association. This is Miss Madeline Zanetti." At the mention of the detective agency, the woman's posture relaxed slightly. "Agnes Miller," she introduced herself, lowering the shotgun. "My husband's away in Denver for supplies." She glanced at the churning sky. "Better come in before you drown." They dismounted, and Agnes directed Pierce to a small lean-to at the side of the cabin where he could shelter the horse. By the time they were all inside, the storm had broken in earnest, rain lashing the windows and wind howling around the eaves. The cabin's interior was simple but clean, with a stone fireplace, a table with 4 chairs, a curtained-off sleeping area, and various frontier necessities hanging from pegs on the walls. A pot of stew bubbled over the fire, filling the space with a savory aroma that reminded Madeline how little they'd eaten that day. Agnes set the shotgun aside but kept it within reach. "You can dry off by the fire," she said, her manner direct but not unfriendly. "There's stew enough for all if you're hungry." "That's very kind," Madeline said gratefully. As they warmed themselves by the fire, Pierce explained their situation in general terms, that they were traveling to Denver and hoping to reach it by the next day. He didn't mention Thorne or their pursuit, but something in his manner must have communicated their urgency. "The creek at the bottom of the hill will be running high after this rain," Agnes said as she ladled stew into wooden bowls for them. "No crossing it till morning at the earliest, I'm afraid." Madeline exchanged a worried glance with Pierce. Every hour of delay gave Thorne more time to set up ambushes along the routes to Denver. "You two married?" Agnes asked abruptly, eyeing them over her own bowl of stew. "No," Madeline answered quickly, feeling heat rise to her cheeks again. "Mr. Dawson is escorting me to Denver." Agnes raised an eyebrow but didn't comment further. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the howling wind and the occasional rumble of thunder. Finally, Agnes spoke again. "You're running from something or someone." It wasn't a question. Out here, folks don't usually travel double on one horse unless there's trouble. Pierce studied the older woman, apparently deciding how much to reveal. "The less you know, the safer you'll be," he said eventually. "But yes, there are men who might come looking for us." "Bad men?" Agnes nodded, unsurprised. "Figured as much." She rose and went to the window, peering out at the storm. "My Jacob and I have been on this homestead 15 years, seen all manner of folk passing through, good, bad, and everything in between, learned to read people pretty quick." She turned back to them. "You two have honest eyes, that's good enough for me." The simple acceptance in her words touched Madeline deeply. In a world where danger lurked around every corner, such trust was rare and precious. As evening settled in and the storm showed no signs of abating, Agnes prepared a makeshift bed near the fire for Pierce, while offering Madeline a space behind the curtain in her own sleeping area. "Propriety matters, even in the wilderness," she declared with a meaningful look at both of them. Later, as Madeline lay on the narrow cot listening to the rain hammering on the roof, she found herself thinking of Pierce, his quiet strength, the pain he carried over his lost love, the way he'd risked everything to save a stranger in that ravine. In just a day, he had become more than a rescuer to her. He had become someone she trusted completely. Sleep eventually claimed her, but her dreams were troubled visions of Thorne's leering face transforming into a more monstrous visage, of gunfire and blood, of Pierce falling before her eyes. She woke with a start in the dark hours before dawn, a cry caught in her throat. Agnes slept soundly in the bed on the other side of the curtain, but as Madeline's eyes adjusted to the darkness, she made out Pierce's silhouette sitting up by the dying fire. He turned at the sound of her movement, and their eyes met across the dimly lit cabin. Without a word, Madeline wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and padded over to sit beside him on the rough plank floor. "Couldn't sleep," he whispered. "Bad dreams," she admitted. He nodded in understanding. "I get them too." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the embers glow and fade in the fireplace. The storm had passed, leaving behind an almost preternatural quiet, as if the world itself were holding its breath. "Pierce," Madeline said finally, her voice barely audible, "what happens when we reach Denver?" He turned to look at her, his face half in shadow. "You'll be safe there. I have friends who can protect you while I deal with Thorne." "And after that," she pressed, "we just go our separate ways." The question hung between them, loaded with unspoken possibilities. Pierce's gaze dropped to her hands, which were twisting nervously in her lap. "Madeline," he began, then hesitated. "I've lived with vengeance as my only purpose for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to live any other way." He looked back up at her, his eyes reflecting the last of the firelight. "But meeting you, it's reminded me there might be something beyond this hunt." Madeline's heart quickened at his words. "I've spent my whole life following my father's dreams," she said softly. "Maybe it's time I found some of my own." Pierce reached out slowly and took her hand in his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Maybe we could find them together," he suggested, his voice rough with emotion, "when this is over." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Madeline found herself leaning toward him almost without realizing it, drawn by a force as inevitable as gravity. Pierce's free hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch feather light. "I shouldn't," he whispered, even as he moved closer. "It's too dangerous to make promises now." "I'm not asking for promises," Madeline replied, "just this moment." Their lips met in a kiss as soft as a whisper, tentative at first, then with growing certainty. Madeline felt something unfurl within her chest, a warmth that spread outward to her fingertips. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing unevenly. "Well," Agnes's voice cut through the darkness, making them both jump, "I suppose that answers my question about you too." They turned to find the older woman standing at the edge of the curtained area, arms crossed, expression unreadable in the dim light. "Madam, Pierce began, but Agnes waved away his explanation. "Save it," she said, though her tone held more amusement than censure. "I was young once too, believe it or not." She moved to the fireplace and stirred the embers, adding a small log. "But if you're both awake, we might as well have some coffee. Dawn's not far off, and you'll want an early start." As Agnes busied herself with the coffee pot, Madeline and Pierce exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Something had shifted, a door opened that could not be closed again. Whatever happened in Denver, they would face it together. True to Agnes's prediction, the creek had indeed risen overnight, but by dawn it had receded enough to be safely crossed. After a hearty breakfast of cornmeal mush and the last of the previous night's stew, they prepared to depart. "Take the trail that follows the ridge," Agnes advised as Pierce saddled his horse. "It's longer, but you'll have better visibility and there's less chance of running into trouble." As they mounted up, Agnes pressed a small cloth bundle into Madeline's hands. "Biscuits and jerky," she explained. "And this." She handed up a small revolver, a .32 caliber pocket pistol. "It was my first gun, not much stopping power, but better than nothing if you need it." I couldn't, Madeline protested, but Agnes cut her off. Take it. Where you're going, you might need it. Her weathered face softened. Besides, I've got my shotgun. Jacob would have my hide if he knew I gave away his mother's revolver, but some things are more important than sentimental value. Madeline tucked the small weapon into her pocket, touched by the woman's generosity. Thank you, Agnes, for everything. The older woman patted her knee. You remind me of myself at your age too, stubborn to back down from a fight. Her gaze shifted to Pierce. You take care of her, Ranger, or you'll answer to me. Pierce tipped his hat respectfully. Yes, madam, I intend to. They rode out as the sun cleared the eastern ridge, following Agnes's suggested trail. The air was fresh and cool after the storm, the landscape washed clean. Under different circumstances, it would have been a glorious morning for a ride. She's quite a woman, Pierce remarked as they left the homestead behind. Yes, Madeline agreed. I wonder if I could ever be that strong building a life out here, facing whatever comes. Pierce's arms tightened slightly around her waist. You already are that strong, Madeline. Most women would have broken after what you've been through. She smiled at the compliment, though he couldn't see it. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts about the night before that brief, stolen moment by the dying fire. Neither mentioned it directly, as if speaking of it might somehow diminish its significance. The ridge trail provided excellent views of the surrounding countryside, allowing them to spot any approach long before they could be ambushed. They saw no sign of pursuit through the morning, and by early afternoon they caught their first distant glimpse of Denver, a sprawl of buildings in a valley ahead, smoke from countless chimneys rising into the clear blue sky. We'll be there before sundown, Pierce said, relief evident in his voice. But as they descended from the ridge toward the more traveled roads that led to the city, Madeline felt a growing unease. It seemed too easy, somehow, after all that had happened. Thorne was not a man to give up so quickly. Her instincts proved correct. As they rounded a bend in the road about 5 miles outside Denver, they came upon a downed tree blocking their path. Pierce reined in sharply, his body tensing. Ambush, he said quietly, scanning the rocks and brush on either side of the road. That tree was felled deliberately. No sooner had he spoken than a voice called out from behind a boulder to their right. That's far enough, Dawson. It was Silas Thorne himself, his distinctive rasp unmistakable. Send the woman over and I might let you live. Pierce's hand went to his gun as he quickly assessed their situation. They were exposed on the road, with rocky outcroppings on both sides providing perfect cover for Thorne and his men. How many do you see? He murmured to Madeline. She scanned the terrain as subtly as she could. 3, I think. Thorne behind that boulder, another man in the trees to the left, and someone on the ridge above. Pierce nodded, impressed by her observation. Same count I have. Odds are better than in the ravine, at least. Come on, Dawson, Thorne shouted. You know how this ends. A man and a woman on one horse against my boys. You're good, but you ain't that good. Pierce leaned close to Madeline's ear. When I give the word, slide off the right side of the horse and get behind that fallen log, he instructed. I'll create a diversion. I have Agnes's revolver, Madeline reminded him. I can help. Pierce hesitated only briefly. All right, just stay low and don't take unnecessary risks. He called back to Thorne. Why don't you come out and face me yourself, Silas, or are you only brave when you're robbing unarmed travelers? The taunt had its intended effect. Thorne cursed loudly. Kill them both, he ordered his men. Now, Pierce hissed, and they both slid from the horse in one fluid motion. Bullets whined overhead as they dove for cover behind the fallen tree. Pierce's stallion bolted a short distance down the road, providing a momentary distraction. Drawing his Colt, Pierce fired 3 rapid shots toward the man in the trees, forcing him to duck back. Madeline pulled Agnes's small revolver from her pocket, her heart pounding but her hands steady. When the man on the ridge exposed himself to take aim at Pierce, she fired. Her shot went wide, but it was close enough to make him flinch and miss his own shot. Good, Pierce encouraged her, pivoting to fire at Thorne's position. The outlaw leader had moved, however, using the distraction to work his way closer. The firefight continued for several tense minutes, a deadly dance of advance and retreat. Pierce managed to wing the man in the trees, who cried out and fell back. But their ammunition was limited, and Thorne seemed content to wait them out. "We need to move," Pierce decided. "They have us pinned, and eventually they'll flank us." Madeline glanced around desperately, looking for options. "The horse," she said suddenly. "If one of us could reach it, we could break through." Pierce shook his head. "Too exposed. They'd cut you down before you got halfway there." "Not if they're busy with you," she argued. "I'm faster than I look, and they won't expect it." Before Pierce could protest further, the decision was made for them. A new voice called from behind them. "Thorne, this is Marshal Collins. You're surrounded. Throw down your weapons." They turned to see a group of riders approaching from the direction of Denver, at least a dozen men, some in the distinctive badges of lawmen, others simply armed civilians. At their head rode a barrel-chested man with a silver star pinned to his vest. Thorne and his remaining men, realizing they were now outnumbered, attempted to flee, but the marshal's posse had surrounded the area. Within minutes, the shooting was over, and the outlaws were in custody, Thorne himself sporting a bullet wound to the shoulder courtesy of one of the deputies. As the lawmen secured their prisoners, Marshal Collins approached Pierce and Madeline, who had emerged from behind their improvised barricade. "Dawson," he greeted Pierce with a firm handshake. "Agnes Miller rode into town at dawn, said you might need some help." "Good woman, that one covered 15 miles in record time." "Remind me to thank her properly," Pierce said with feeling. "Marshal, this is Miss Madeline Zanetti." The marshal tipped his hat respectfully. "Madam, heard you've had quite an ordeal." "It's over now, thanks to you and your men," Madeline replied, still somewhat dazed by their sudden rescue. "And thanks to Agnes," Pierce added. "I should have known she wouldn't just send us off without making sure we had backup." As they rode into Denver with the posse, Thorne and his men bound and under heavy guard, Madeline felt a strange mix of emotions: relief that the danger had passed, gratitude for Agnes's foresight, and an undeniable sadness that her time with Pierce might soon come to an end. Their shared peril had forged a connection between them that went beyond mere attraction, but with Thorne captured and her immediate safety secured, what reason would Pierce have to remain at her side? The city of Denver spread before them, its buildings a mix of frontier rawness and emerging sophistication. Gas lamps were being lit along the main streets as dusk approached, giving the growing metropolis a warm, welcoming glow. For Madeline, who had spent most of her life in mining camps and on the edges of civilization, the sight was both intimidating and thrilling. Marshal Collins led them to the jailhouse, a solid brick building that stood as a testament to Denver's commitment to law and order. After seeing Thorne and his men securely locked away, the marshal invited Pierce and Madeline to his office. "You'll both need to give statements," he explained, pouring them each a cup of coffee from a pot that had been warming on a small stove. "But that can wait till morning." "You look dead on your feet." "We've had a long couple of days," Pierce acknowledged, gratefully accepting the coffee. "I've arranged rooms for you at the Denver house," Collins said. "Best hotel in town, and the owner owes me a favor. Miss Zanetti will be comfortable there while we sort out this mess with Thorne." Madeline, who had been staring out the window at the unfamiliar city streets, turned back at this. "How long will that take?" The marshal stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "Well, with the charges against him, multiple murders, robbery, attempted murder of you two, he'll hang for certain. But the legal proceedings might take a few weeks, maybe longer. We'll need your testimonies at the trial." "A few weeks." The words echoed in Madeline's mind. A reprieve, then time to decide what came next, time to explore whatever was growing between her and Pierce. As if reading her thoughts, Pierce glanced her way, a question in his eyes that she answered with a small smile. After finishing their coffee and making arrangements to return in the morning, they stepped out into the Denver evening. The air was cooler here than in the ravine where their journey had begun, the higher elevation bringing a crispness that felt cleansing after all they'd endured. A deputy escorted them to the Denver house, a 3-story building that represented the height of frontier luxury. Inside, the lobby featured polished wood floors, potted palms, and actual upholstered furniture, a far cry from the rough cabins and trading posts Madeline was accustomed to. They were given adjacent rooms on the second floor, with a connecting door between them, a compromise between propriety and security, as the deputy explained with a knowing look that made Madeline blush. After he left them, they stood somewhat awkwardly in the hallway, suddenly uncertain now that the immediate danger had passed and they found themselves in civilization again. "Well," Pierce said finally, "you should get some rest. It's been a long day." "Yes," Madeline agreed, though rest was far from her mind. Pierce, she hesitated, not sure what she wanted to say. "Thank you for saving my life. I'm not ready for this to end. I think I might be falling in love with you." Before she could find the words, Pierce stepped closer and took her hands in his. "Madeline," he said, his voice low and intense, "I meant what I said last night. When this is all over, really over, with Thorne facing justice, I want to see if there could be something between us. If you want that too." Relief and joy flooded through her. "I do want that," she said simply. "Very much." His smile then was like the sunrise, transforming his weathered face and lighting his eyes with a hope she hadn't seen there before. Gently, he pulled her closer and bent to kiss her, not the hesitant, questioning kiss of the previous night, but one filled with promise and certainty. When they parted, both were a little breathless. "Good night, Madeline," Pierce said, reluctantly releasing her hands. "I'll see you in the morning." "Good night, Pierce," she replied, unlocking her door but looking back at him with a smile. "Sweet dreams." "They will be now," he assured her, and the look in his eyes stayed with her long after she'd closed her door. The following weeks in Denver passed in a whirlwind of activity. Madeline and Pierce gave their formal statements about the events in the ravine and the subsequent pursuit. The testimonies of other victims of Thorne's gang were also collected, building an ironclad case against the outlaw leader. In the meantime, Madeline began to explore the possibilities Denver offered. With Pierce's encouragement, she visited several empty storefronts that might serve as potential locations for the bookshop she dreamed of opening. Though her funds were limited, the small but steady income from her father's mine might be enough to make a start, especially if she could find a backer. Pierce, for his part, was offered a permanent position with the Denver police force, which he was seriously considering. His reputation as the man who had finally brought down Silas Thorne with some help, as he always insisted on pointing out, had spread throughout the city, earning him respect from lawmen and citizens alike. They spent their evenings together, sometimes dining at the hotel's restaurant, other times exploring the growing city's attractions. Pierce took Madeline to the opera house he'd told her about that first night, where they saw a traveling company perform The Barber of Seville. Neither of them understood Italian, but the music and spectacle enchanted them nonetheless. As they walked back to the hotel that night, Madeline on Pierce's arm, she felt a contentment she hadn't known was possible. The uncertainty of the future remained, but for the first time she was facing it with hope rather than trepidation. "Penny for your thoughts," Pierce said, noticing her reflective mood. Madeline smiled up at him. "I was just thinking how strange life is. If Thorne hadn't cornered me in that ravine, if you hadn't ridden down to face them, we never would have met." "Maybe we would have," Pierce countered. "In another way at another time." "Do you believe that?" she asked. "That some people are meant to find each other?" He considered the question seriously, as he did most things. 5 years ago, I would have said no. After Sarah died, I didn't believe in much of anything beyond my own need for vengeance. His hand covered hers where it rested on his arm. "But meeting you, it makes me wonder if there isn't some greater plan after all." They had reached the hotel, but neither made a move to enter. The night was mild, with stars visible even through the city's gaslights, and they were reluctant to end their evening. "Come with me," Pierce said suddenly. "There's something I want to show you." Curious, Madeline allowed him to lead her away from the hotel and through several side streets until they reached a small, tree-lined square. In the center stood a simple gazebo, its white paint gleaming in the moonlight. "I found this place my second day in Denver," Pierce explained as they climbed the steps into the gazebo. It reminded me of a similar one in my hometown in Texas, where young couples would go walking on Sunday afternoons. Madeline ran her hand along the smooth wooden railing. It's lovely. Pierce took both her hands in his expression serious in the silvery light. Madeline, these past weeks have been the happiest I can remember since, well, in a very long time. Her heart quickened at his tone. For me too, she admitted. I know it's fast, he continued, and maybe I'm a fool for rushing, but life out here has taught me that tomorrow is never guaranteed. He took a deep breath. What I'm trying to say, not very eloquently, is that I've fallen in love with you, Madeline Zanetti. And if you'll have me, I'd like to court you properly, with the intention of making you my wife someday. Tears sprang to Madeline's eyes, but they were tears of joy. Yes, she whispered. Oh, Pierce, yes. He gathered her into his arms then, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. When he kissed her, it felt like coming home after a long journey, like finding a place she belonged after a lifetime of wandering. The trial of Silas Thorne and his remaining gang members began 3 weeks after their capture. The courthouse was packed each day with curious citizens and the families of Thorne's victims, all eager to see justice served. Madeline testified about her father's mining claim and how Thorne had tried to steal it, culminating in the confrontation in the ravine. When asked to identify the man who had cornered her, she pointed directly at Thorne, her hands steady and her voice clear. Pierce's testimony followed, describing how he'd tracked the gang after the stagecoach robbery and happened upon the scene in the ravine. His account of facing down all 7 outlaws alone drew murmurs of appreciation from the spectators. On the trial's 5th day, the jury returned their verdict, guilty on all counts. The judge, a stern man with a reputation for harsh sentences for violent crimes, ordered Thorne and his 2 surviving men to be hanged in 1 week's time. As they left the courthouse after the sentencing, Pierce seemed pensive. Madeline waited until they were alone in the small garden behind the hotel before asking what troubled him. I thought I'd feel different, he admitted, sitting beside her on a wrought iron bench. All these years, I've dreamed of seeing Thorne pay for what he did to Sarah and all his other victims. Now that it's happening. He trailed off, searching for the words. It doesn't bring them back, Madeline finished softly. Pierce nodded. Exactly. Justice will be served, but it doesn't heal what was broken. He looked at her, his eyes vulnerable in a way she rarely saw. You're what's healing me, Madeline, not vengeance, love. She leaned her head against his shoulder, understanding completely. So what happens now, after the execution? I've been thinking about that, he said. The position with the Denver police is tempting, but I'm not sure it's right for me anymore. I've had my fill of hunting men like Thorne. What about your ranch dream? Madeline asked. The one by the Brazos River? A smile touched his lips. I've been saving most of what I earned as a ranger and detective. It might be enough for a start, especially if we combine it with the income from your mine. Our mine, she corrected him. If we're to be partners in life, we should be partners in everything. His arm tightened around her shoulders. Our mine, then. Between that and my savings, we could buy a decent piece of land, not in Texas, perhaps too many ghosts there, but here in Colorado, there's good ranchland south of Denver. And Denver itself is close enough that I could still open my bookshop one day, Madeline added, warming to the idea. Perhaps not right away, but someday. They sat together in the garden until twilight deepened into night, planning their future, a future neither had dared to imagine just a few short weeks ago. The day after Thorne's execution, Pierce took Madeline to see a property he'd been quietly investigating. Located about 20 miles south of Denver, it comprised 100 acres of good grazing land with a year-round creek, a small stand of timber, and a modest but sound cabin that could be expanded over time. As they rode the boundaries of what might become their home, Madeline could see Pierce's excitement growing. His knowledge of cattle and land management, learned in his youth in Texas, would serve them well here. For her part, she found herself imagining gardens around the cabin, perhaps a few fruit trees, and eventually, children playing in the yard. What do you think? Pierce asked as they sat on their horses atop a small rise surveying the property. Could you see yourself building a life here?" Madeline looked around at the rolling grasslands backed by the distant, majestic peaks of the Rockies, then back at the man beside her, the man who had ridden alone into a ravine to save a stranger and had ended up saving himself in the process. "Yes," she said simply. "With you, I could build a life anywhere." The following Sunday, they rode together to Agnes Miller's homestead to share their news and properly thank her for her role in their rescue. The older woman received them with characteristic bluntness but obvious pleasure. "About time you came back," she greeted them. "Was beginning to think you'd forgotten who saved your hides." Pierce dismounted and helped Madeline down from her horse. "We could never forget, Agnes, and we've brought something to show our gratitude." From his saddlebag, he produced the deed to Agnes's homestead, which they had purchased from the bank that held the mortgage. Jacob Miller, it turned out, had been struggling to make the payments, a fact he'd kept from his proud wife. "It's yours, free and clear," Madeline explained as Agnes stared at the document in disbelief. "No more payments, no risk of foreclosure." Tears welled in the older woman's eyes, a sight that shocked both of them, as Agnes had struck them as someone who never cried. "You too," she said gruffly, wiping at her eyes with her apron. "Coming in here with your fancy papers and your good deeds." But she hugged them both tightly, and when Jacob returned from checking their livestock, the four of them shared a celebration dinner during which Pierce and Madeline announced their engagement. "Well, I knew that was coming from the moment I caught you two mooning over each other by my fire," Agnes declared, raising her cup in a toast. "To finding love in unexpected places and to facing down 7 outlaws alone." As spring bloomed across the Colorado countryside, Pierce and Madeline were married in a simple ceremony in Denver's newest church. Marshall Collins stood as Pierce's best man, while Agnes, surprisingly resplendent in a dress she'd saved for special occasions, attended Madeline. They moved into the cabin on their new ranch the day after their wedding. That first night, as they stood on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Pierce pulled Madeline close against the evening chill. "Happy?" he asked softly. She turned in his arms to look up at him, this man who had risked everything for her when she was nothing to him but a stranger in danger. "More than I ever imagined possible," she assured him. As the stars began to appear one by one in the darkening sky, they went inside together, closing the door on the wilderness beyond, not in fear, as Madeline once might have done, but in the comfortable knowledge that whatever dangers tomorrow might bring, they would face them together. Their love forged in the fire of that desperate day in the ravine when an outlaw gang had cornered a determined woman, and a lone cowboy had ridden down to face them all. 5 years later, the Dawson Ranch had prospered beyond their initial hopes. Pierce's knowledge of cattle breeding had resulted in a herd particularly well suited to the Colorado climate, and their reputation for quality stock had spread throughout the territory. The original cabin had been expanded to a comfortable house with a wide porch where they often sat in the evenings, watching their 3-year-old son, Thomas, play under the watchful eye of his 1-year-old sister. Sarah, named for the woman Pierce had once loved and lost. Madeline had indeed opened her bookshop in Denver, traveling into the city twice a week to oversee its operation while a hired girl minded the store on other days. The venture had proven surprisingly successful, becoming a gathering place for the city's growing population of educated settlers and a source of reading material for remote homesteads throughout the region. Agnes and Jacob Miller remained their closest neighbors and dearest friends, with Agnes serving as an honorary grandmother to the children. The older woman had softened somewhat over the years, though she still kept her shotgun loaded and maintained that a woman alone needs to be twice as tough as any man. On the 5th anniversary of their meeting in the ravine, Pierce surprised Madeline with a special gift, a silver locket containing a tiny painting of the two of them with their children, created by a traveling artist who had stayed at their ranch the previous autumn. "To remember how it all began," Pierce said as he fastened the chain around her neck, "and how far we've come." Later that night, after the children were asleep, they sat together on the porch, Madeline nestled against Pierce's side as they gazed up at the star-filled sky. The same stars had witnessed their first desperate meeting, their flight across the wilderness, and now their settled happiness. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been?" Madeline asked, fingering the locket at her throat. "If Thorne hadn't cornered me, if you hadn't ridden into that ravine." Pierce considered the question, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "I used to believe life was just a series of random events, some good, some terrible, with no rhyme or reason to any of it." He looked down at her, his eyes reflecting the soft lamplight from inside their home. "But now I can't help thinking there was something more at work that day. Call it fate, call it divine intervention. Whatever it was, I'm grateful for it every day." Madeline smiled, thinking of all they had built together, their home, their family, their love. From that moment of terror in the ravine had come the greatest joy she had ever known. "So am I," she whispered, reaching up to touch his cheek, "my brave cowboy who faced 7 alone." Pierce turned his head to kiss her palm. "For you, my love, I would face 100. And as they sat together under the vast Colorado sky, surrounded by the life they had created from the ashes of their separate tragedies, both knew with absolute certainty that they had found something rare and precious, a love born in danger, but built to last through all the seasons of their lives. In the years that followed, their family and their enterprises continued to grow. Pierce's expertise with cattle led to partnerships with other ranchers, forming a cooperative that helped all of them weather the inevitable lean years and natural disasters that challenged those who worked the land. Madeline's bookshop expanded to include a small printing press that published a regional newspaper and agricultural bulletins that shared knowledge among the scattered homesteads. Thomas grew into a thoughtful boy with his father's steady nature and his mother's love of books, while little Sarah showed early signs of being as spirited and determined as her namesake had reportedly been. When their third child, James, arrived 2 years after Sarah, the Dawson family seemed complete, but life on the frontier was never entirely predictable or safe. In the winter of 1885, when a blizzard of historic proportions swept across the plains, Pierce and his ranch hands found themselves battling desperately to save their cattle from freezing to death. For 3 days and nights, they worked without rest, bringing as many animals as possible into sheltered areas and providing what fodder they could. On the 4th morning, with the storm finally abating, Pierce failed to return from checking a remote section of the range where some of the herd had been trapped. Madeline, frantic with worry, organized a search party from the neighboring ranches, but it was Agnes who found him unconscious, half buried in snow, with a broken leg from where his horse had fallen in a hidden gully. For days, Pierce hovered between life and death, fever raging as infection set into the compound fracture. Madeline refused to leave his side, bathing his burning forehead with cool cloths and forcing broth between his cracked lips whenever he showed signs of consciousness. "You will not leave me," she told him fiercely during one of his more lucid moments. "Do you hear me, Pierce Dawson? You faced down 7 outlaws for a woman you didn't even know. You can fight this for the woman who loves you more than life itself." Whether it was her determined nursing, the doctor's eventual arrival with proper medicines, or simply Pierce's own stubborn will to live, the fever broke on the 6th day. Recovery was slow and painful. The leg would never be quite the same, but by spring, he was walking again with the aid of a cane, and by summer he was back in the saddle, though he tired more easily than before. The experience changed them both. Madeline, confronted with the possibility of losing Pierce, became more determined than ever to savor every moment of their life together. Pierce, whose brush with death had given him a new perspective, found himself less driven to expand their holdings and more focused on enjoying what they had already built. They began taking time for themselves, occasional trips to Denver for the theater or concerts, picnics with the children by the creek that ran through their property, quiet evenings reading aloud to each other from Madeline's ever-growing collection of books. On the 10th anniversary of their meeting, they hosted a celebration at the ranch that brought together friends and neighbors from miles around. The house and yard were decorated with lanterns and wildflowers. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by every attending family, and a local fiddler provided music for dancing late into the night. As the celebration wound down, with children sleeping on blankets under the stars and adults gathered in small groups around the remaining lanterns, Marshall Collins, now retired, and silver-haired, raised his glass in a toast. "To Pierce and Madeline," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. "Who remind us all that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is open their heart to love, even when the odds seem stacked against them." Later, as they prepared for bed in the quiet of their room, Madeline found Pierce standing by the window, looking out at the last of their guests making their way home by moonlight. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. He smiled down at her, the lines at the corners of his eyes deeper now but his gaze still as warm and steady as the day they met. "I was thinking about that ravine," he admitted. "About how terrified I actually was facing those 7 men, though I tried not to show it. You were terrified." Madeline asked, surprised even after all these years. In her memory, he had always been fearless. "Absolutely," he confirmed with a soft laugh. "My hands were shaking so badly I'm still not sure how I hit anything with that first shot. But then I looked at you, this brave, beautiful woman refusing to cower even with 7 guns pointed at her, and suddenly, being afraid didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was making sure you survived." Madeline leaned against him, feeling the solid strength of him, not the invincible hero of her memories, but something better, a real man who had faced his fears and acted with courage despite them. "We saved each other that day," she said softly, "and we've been saving each other ever since." Pierce turned from the window and took her in his arms. "And we always will," he promised, bending to kiss her with all the tenderness and passion of their years together. As their children grew, the story of how their parents met became a favorite bedtime request. Pierce and Madeline took turns telling it, each adding details the other might have forgotten, shaping the tale to be age-appropriate but never hiding the core truth. That sometimes love arrives in the most unexpected ways, and that courage often means facing impossible odds for someone else's sake rather than your own. Thomas, the oldest, took naturally to ranching, working alongside his father from an early age and soaking up knowledge like a sponge. Sarah, true to her namesake and her mother, developed both intelligence and independence, eventually becoming one of the first women admitted to the University of Colorado. James, the youngest, showed an aptitude for both books and animals, suggesting he might one day combine his parents' separate passions. In 1895, 20 years after that fateful day in the ravine, Denver hosted a grand exhibition celebrating the growth and development of Colorado since achieving statehood. Pierce and Madeline attended with their children, marveling at how the rough frontier town had transformed into a thriving city with electric lights, a streetcar system, and buildings that rivaled those in eastern cities. As they wandered through the exhibition hall, Thomas, now 18 and as tall as his father, suddenly called them over to a display of newspaper articles and photographs documenting significant events in the territory's history. There, preserved behind glass, was a yellowed newspaper clipping with the headline, "Lone Ranger faces 7 outlaws, rescues lady from certain death." Beneath it was a somewhat fanciful illustration of a man on horseback confronting a group of armed villains in a rocky setting, while a woman looked on from the background. "Is that supposed to be you, Pa?" Sarah asked, studying the illustration with critical 14-year-old eyes. "They didn't get your face right at all," Pierce laughed, shaking his head at the dramatized version of events. "Newspaper artists tend to use their imagination more than their eyes," he remarked, "but yes, I suppose that's meant to be me." 12-year-old James peered at the accompanying article. "It says you were a famous Texas Ranger who single-handedly defeated the notorious Thorn Gang to save the beautiful daughter of a mining magnate." He looked up at his parents. Was Grandpa really a mining magnate? Ma, Madeline, and Pierce exchanged amused glances. Your grandfather was many things, Madeline said diplomatically, but magnate might be stretching the truth a bit. And your father had some help bringing Thorne to justice from the Denver marshals and a very determined homesteader named Agnes Miller. Why do they always leave out the important parts? Sarah demanded, indignant on her mother's behalf. They make it sound like you just stood there and waited to be rescued. Because the truth is usually more complicated than the stories people want to tell, Pierce explained, putting an arm around his daughter's shoulders. And sometimes, the most important parts of a story are the quietest ones, the ones that happen after the gunsmoke clears. Like falling in love. Sarah suggested, her indignation softening into romantic interest despite her usual practical nature. Exactly like that, Madeline confirmed with a smile. As they continued through the exhibition, Madeline found herself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment, from terror in a lonely ravine to the peaceful prosperity of their ranch, from strangers thrown together by violence to partners sharing the deep, abiding love that had sustained them through challenges both dramatic and mundane. That evening, back at the hotel where they were staying for the exhibition, Pierce found Madeline on the balcony of their room, looking out over the city lights. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, echoing the phrase he had used so often over their years together. She turned to him with a smile, noting how the silver at his temples caught the lamplight. At 48, Pierce Dawson was still a handsome man, the years having added character rather than diminished his appeal. "I was thinking about something Agnes said at our wedding," Madeline replied. "Remember, she toasted to finding love in unexpected places." Pierce nodded, coming to stand beside her at the railing. "I remember, it's strange, isn't it?" Madeline continued. "How the worst day of my life, being cornered by those outlaws, certain I was about to die, turned out to be the best day too, because it brought you to me." Pierce took her hand, his thumb tracing absent patterns on her skin, a habit of 20 years that still sent warmth cascading through her. "Life has a way of surprising us," he agreed. "When I rode into that ravine, I was only thinking about stopping Thorne. I had no idea I was riding toward my future, toward a happiness I'd given up believing in." Madeline leaned against him, grateful beyond words for the solid presence of this man who had been her protector, her partner, and her love for 2 decades. "Do you think we would have found each other anyway if not for that day?" Pierce considered the question seriously, as was his way. "I'd like to think so," he said finally. "Though it might have taken longer, been less dramatic," he chuckled. "Maybe we would have met at a church social or a town meeting." "And you would have courted me properly from the beginning," Madeline suggested, warming to the idea, "without anyone shooting at us." "I would have brought you flowers instead of ammunition," Pierce agreed with a smile. "Asked your father's permission to call on you if he'd still been alive." "And I would have made you work for my affections," Madeline teased, "instead of falling in love with you after just 2 days on the run." Pierce turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "However it happened, Madeline Dawson, finding you has been the greatest blessing of my life. These 20 years with you have been worth every struggle, every pain, every moment of fear that came before." Madeline felt tears prick her eyes at the simple sincerity in his words. After all their years together, Pierce still had the ability to touch her heart with his straightforward declarations of love. "And our next 20 years?" she asked softly. "What do you see for us then?" Pierce gazed out over the city lights for a moment, then back to her face. "I see us growing old together at the ranch," he said, "watching our children make their own way in the world, welcoming grandchildren someday." His eyes crinkled with humor. "I see you still correcting my grammar and making me read poetry I don't understand but pretend to appreciate because it makes you happy." Madeline laughed, the sound as light and joyful as it had been when they were young. "And I see you still teaching our grandchildren to ride and shoot, still being the most honorable man I've ever known, still making me feel safe and cherished every day." Pierce pulled her close, his arms encircling her with the familiar comfort that had been her haven for 20 years. To the next 20 years, then, he murmured against her hair, and 20 more after that, if we're lucky. To our life together, Madeline agreed, lifting her face for his kiss as the Denver night wrapped around them, stars shining overhead just as they had on that first night when a desperate woman and a brave cowboy had found in each other the love that would define their lives. In that moment, as in countless others over their years together, Madeline knew with absolute certainty that she would never regret being cornered in that ravine, because it had led Pierce Dawson to ride down and face 7 outlaws alone, not just saving her life, but giving her a life worth living, a love worth cherishing, and a story worth telling for generations to come.